Right, let's do one more interview before we end the show. Now, as government opens up the economy in level 2 of the COVID-19 lockdown, it is still a situation whereby we need urgent economic recovery plans and, of course, a strategy beyond what the Department of Public Works concept in which South Africa creates more needed infrastructure and employs more people actually says. So some economists also say that the damage to the economy has already been done, and they are skeptical about the plans that the ruling party may have to use more infrastructure projects in order to save or create jobs. So joining us now is Dawie Roodt, the chief economist of the Efficient Group, who says that government needs to come up with a focused and urgent economic recovery plan. Dawie, always good to speak to you. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning to you. Thank you very much.
So, Dawie, why are you skeptical about this infrastructure build program? Because isn't this the most logical way to actually kickstart an ailing economy?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I must agree with you. I think, and I agree with organized labor, which I don't often do, and I agree with business, and I agree with government that an infrastructure build program is the way to get this economy going again. But there are many problems with an infrastructure build program, especially when government is involved, because history tells us that whenever government is involved, these kind of projects simply do not work that well. But apart from that, simply looking at some of the macroeconomic aggregates, it's going to be extremely difficult to fund this. Let me give you one example. The fiscal deficit in the current financial year is going to be approximately 15% to GDP. South Africa's savings is a little bit more than that. So basically what happens is that the state today borrows long-term money and spend it on short-term current expenditure, and the total amount of money that is being destroyed in the process, capital that's being destroyed, runs into hundreds of billions of rands. So that is something that we need to fix first. Or to put it differently, if we want to invest in infrastructure, the state must stop destroying savings, and the state must cut back on its current expenditure before we can afford this. So yes, I'm very much in favor of an infrastructural spend program. The problem is just, where are we going to get the money from? Just do not have sufficient savings in the economy to fund a huge project like this.
So when you talk about cuts in expenditure, we've been hearing this song for the longest time. So as an economist, if you were to give advice, where should the state start trimming?
Well, there are only two obvious places. The one is, and this is the difficult part of it because it has to do with politics, but the one has to be on the wage bill. We have too many civil servants that are overpaid in South Africa. We simply cannot afford them anymore. So we have to do something about the wage bill. It's not only national government, but the same goes to the local province and the provincial governments as well. So we have to cut back on state current expenditure, and the biggest expense item is the wage bill. That's one. The second one is the state-owned enterprises. We simply cannot afford it to bail out South African Airways, as an example. Now we can see what's going on at Danel at the moment, what's going on at Prasa, and all those other state-owned enterprises. But we just don't have the money for that. But even if we cut back on the state-owned enterprises, it's going to be extremely difficult on the wage bill, because already organized labor has made it very clear that they are not they're simply not going to allow the state to cut back on the wage bill. And in fact, I think there's a very good possibility that we're going to see strikes coming from the civil servants over the next couple of weeks or so. And that, I believe, is one of our major issues in South Africa, is that the relationship government and organized labor, that is something that we need to fix, because especially COSATU has become the tail that is wagging the dog.
So some economists saying, Dawie, that the damage to the economy has already been done. Moving to level 2 at this stage, perhaps too late in the day. But given where we are now, let's start by first looking at the pre-COVID-19 problems as they existed. And then COVID-19 happened. What do you believe government should have done then in order to deal with what is essentially and fundamentally a health pandemic?
Yeah, maybe I can just make a comment about where the economy finds itself at the moment. And I've been trying to figure out what's the difference between a recession and a depression, because we don't have specific definitions for either one of these two. But basically, a recession is part of the cycle. Economies grow and contract and grow and contract. And that is a recession. It's a normal part of the economic cycle. What we're currently experiencing is not a normal thing. It's nothing normal. What we're seeing is an economy that has been broken. This is indeed a depression. And I've made some calculations. The average South African's income is likely to fall by approximately close to 15% this year. And if that is the case, then we will be knocked back to where we were last in 1981 in terms of per capita GDP. So we're going through a crisis. This is without a doubt a crisis. But this is not a new crisis because we were in trouble before this virus, before this pandemic. The average South African has been getting poorer for 5 years already. The state finances was heading for a fiscal debt trap already before COVID-19 hit the world. And this is simply going to exacerbate and make things much, much more difficult. So what we should have been prepared, not necessarily for a virus, but we should have managed the state accounts much, much better beforehand, because now we're in a situation where we simply do not have dry ammunition to support the economy anymore. If you look, for example, at the so-called 500 billion support package by government, that certainly is not 500 billion. It's significantly less than that. But it's not nearly enough to support the South African economy. We actually need a stimulus project or program of 1 or 2 or 3 trillion rand to support the South African economy. But because of the mismanagement of the fiscal accounts previously, we simply do not have the capacity to support the economy anymore.
So before we talk about solutions, Dawie, because I think it's important that we try and find a way out of this mess, you talk about per capita GDP levels being knocked back to 1981 levels. What does that mean for the ordinary person on the street? How does that actually play out for you and I and, the ordinary person in South Africa?
Yeah, I remember when you use averages, that's a very rough estimate of what's going on. It's just to give you a rough idea of what's going on your economy, because there are many other differences as well. What we're seeing today is South Africa's got record high levels of unemployment. And so what the economic activity that is taking place is mostly benefiting wealthier individuals, people with better qualifications, while we have many, many poor people that simply do not participate in this new economy. Put differently, we're seeing a huge increase in inequality in South Africa. So you ask me what should be done to fix the South African economy, and that's actually an easy answer. There are many things that can be done. Most economists will be able to tell you what should be done. And we've touched on 1 or 2 of those things, like, for example, cutting back on state spending. But I believe that the main issues in South Africa has to do with politics. It's not really economics that the issues are. Let me give you 3 issues that I think needs to be resolved before we can really talk about a revival in the economy. The first one is there's a leadership issue in government. We just do not know who's in charge in government. The second issue is an ideological issue. We just don't know what government stands for. Are they going to revive South African Airways, or are they going to liquidate South African Airways? We just don't know. Are they going to force pension funds to invest in certain state-owned enterprises, or are they not? Apparently not, but we just don't know. We don't have clarity on that. And the third one, and I've mentioned this already, is the relationship between the ANC and organised labour. That's something that needs to be resolved. And until we've resolved those 3 issues, I'm afraid the South African economy will just keep on going on the way that we have been the last couple of years, and will keep on going the next couple of months. So we need to sort out the political issues before we really can start addressing the economic issues. But the most important economic issue at this moment is to stabilize the fiscal accounts, and that inevitably means that we have to cut back on state spending, and that inevitably means that there must be some sort of confrontation between government and organised labour.
So when you say that, we don't know all these answers to a variety of questions, and throws a whole lot of balls up in the air, but if one specifically hones in on the question of who is in charge of the South African economy, if you cannot categorically state that, surely that's problematic, Dawie, because how then are your solutions meant to be implemented if you don't know who to direct it at, because you don't know who's in charge of the economy? So who is in charge of the South African economy?
Well, I don't know. I don't know who's in charge of the South African economy. I get the opportunity to speak to international investors and the international press quite a lot. And they ask me, for example, are we going to nationalize the South African Reserve Bank? Or they ask me, are we going to change the mandate of the South African Reserve Bank? Because that is what the ANC says they want to do. But that is not what the president says. And that is not what the Minister of Finance says. And that is not what the governor of the South African Reserve Bank say. So I just don't know. Are we going to change the mandate of the South African Reserve Bank or are we not? Are we going to nationalize the Reserve Bank or are we not going to do that? That's an excellent example of confusion regarding leadership and regarding policy, macroeconomic policy in South Africa. And there are many other examples. South African Airways. Look at the total mess that they've made with South African Airways. It's still in limbo somewhere. They promised money will come from somewhere. Nobody knows where the money is going to come from. We're talking about nearly 500 billion rand that Eskom needs. They need at least 200 billion of that to be financially viable. Nobody knows where the money is going to come from. I don't know. So if you ask me who's in charge of the economy, I don't know. I can't answer you. In fact, I don't even understand what the real macroeconomic policies are that we're following today in South Africa.
So, given that you don't know the answers to so many of these questions, and you're an economist, if you don't know, I mean, who should know? How do lay South Africans go about navigating this minefield? How practical are your suggestions then? Who's supposed to implement them?
Well, I can tell you, I told you that one of the biggest issues that we need to address, we need to cut back on the wage bill. And the Minister of Finance said he's going to cut back on the wage bill, by the way. Kusatu said it's not going to happen, and they're all part of the tripartite alliance.
The previous minister said that as well.
Yeah, and they all failed. They all failed, especially Minister Pravin Gordhan. And I must tell you, I blame him for much of the troubles in which we are in today, because Pravin Gordhan was the Minister of Finance when things really started going horribly wrong. It wasn't all his fault, of course. We had Zuma at that stage, and we had the financial crisis and all that. But Pravin Gordhan, he was in charge of the checkbook, so to speak, when things started going wrong. But yes, certainly there are guys like, for example, the Minister of Finance that certainly wants to change the trajectory of the state's finances. He's got some plans that he wants to implement, but he's being prevented from doing that because of the infighting in government and the uncertainty about policies and all that. So I think before, like I've said, before we can address these sort of issues, we have to sort out our political issues. We know that the president is a weak president in terms of his margin, in his win. He won by a very tiny margin. We know there's a lot of backfighting behind the curtains within the tripartite alliance. We see that all the time. We know that they come out with different statements. The Secretary General is coming out with a statement. The President is coming out with another statement. Something that I'm very much concerned about is just after the emergency budget of the Minister of Finance, the President did not come out and say he supports the Minister of Finance. So I've got a suspicion that the President is not fully behind the Minister of Finance. Mm. And the Minister of Finance, I can tell you, Tito Mboweni, is probably the best that the ANC can offer in terms of the Ministry of Finance. And I've got a suspicion he's not going to be around for much longer. He's either going to jump or he's going to be pushed and go and look after his avos in Zanin.
Well, we can talk so much about that in terms of why business seems to favor Tito Mboweni as Minister of Finance and forces to the left of the paradigm not completely on board with what it is that he has to offer. But let's park that there as a conversation for another day, because I just want to wrap this up speaking to an earlier conversation that I had with Dr. Kgosientsho Ramokgopa about the infrastructure bill program. And I stated your views up front as well. So looking at what is promised, what is envisaged, would you still completely dismiss the infrastructure plan, especially given that the country's structural needs as well as the urgent needs for jobs is at stake here?
Absolutely. No, I agree absolutely that we need to, infrastructure is the way to go about doing this. Infrastructure, unfortunately, bridges and roads and dams do not vote. Unfortunately, but civil servants do vote. So it's quite often it's a choice between either are we going to pay the wages to the civil servants or are we going to put money into infrastructure. There simply is not money available. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the pension fund or the savings industry putting money into infrastructure, and I believe they should be doing that. But you cannot force them, and there's a big fear amongst investors in that there will be some sort of prescribed assets. I know that the ANC came out with a statement this morning saying there's not going to be forced investments or prescribed assets, but the reality is the sums simply do not add up. An infrastructure drive recovery plan is something that I think we will all support. The question just is, where is the money going to come from, and will these investments be profitable investments and attractive investments for the savings industry to invest in? It's possible to do that, but looking at the track record of government, I must say I'm a little bit skeptical.
Well, Dawie, thanks so much for your time. Dawie Roodt talking to us about government's need for an economic recovery plan to save the country financially beyond the current infrastructure initiative that we spoke to Dr. Ramokgopa about earlier as well. So that's where we're going to have to leave it in terms of interviews this morning, and basically it wraps the show, Leanne.